we are temporal creatures. We live in time, and we tend to kind of extrapolate whatever's happening right now all the way into the future. And that is a fundamental error.
I have a product that is not selling, and the reason it's not selling is because it's not a product that people want, and I overcompensate by working hard on promoting it.
You wrote, the enemy of productivity isn't laziness, but busy work.
I see people who work hard as a way to overcompensate some problem that they don't want to face, some skill that they don't want to learn. The problem is not working hard, is working hard as the solution.
Everybody has fears, and the only way to deal with them is to work through them, not try to avoid them.
It's not the fastest skier who wins the race, but the fastest one of those who finish the race.
Hard work doesn't scale.
You don't promote someone because they did their previous work excellently, but you promote someone because they demonstrated that they will be able to handle the next role.
Perfectionism is a 100% tax. In other words, it doesn't really exist, Plato notwithstanding. Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another episode of Infinite Loops. My guest today is Luca Dellanna, who I have been waiting to talk to forever because he has so much good advice in the books that he's written, in the projects that he works on. Talk about a guy with a multiple skill stack. Trained as an auto engineer, you consulted at DuPont. You then moved on to your own path as an independent consultant in 2016. I love the fact that you've lived in Spain, Germany, Kazakhstan. I'm going to ask you about Kazakhstan.
Yes.
Singapore and Italy. And your books, 100 Truths You Will Learn Too Late. We're going to talk about all of this and more. Luca, welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for having me.
So let's jump right in. Ergodicity and ergodic things are often, people say, what? Huh? What's that mean? But as somebody who spent a career in asset management, I have to and know all about them and think about them deeply. So for our audience that doesn't know what those terms mean, let's just kind of start at basic principles so that they can understand what we're talking about and what you speak quite a bit about in terms of where people often go wrong.
Yes. So before introducing the terms, like in the book, for example, I only introduced the terms after a half. And it's because I find much better to first use an example and then explain, pointing out at what we are looking for.
Perfect.
And in the book, I use the example of my cousin, who's a skier. And he was an excellent skier, very young. He made it to the World Cup for his age bracket. And then a couple of injuries stopped his career very early. And the lesson I got from him is that it's not the fastest skier who wins the race, but the fastest one of those who finish the race. And the principle will be that survival matters a lot for performance. How much? And I make an example with a few numbers, very simple example. I'm thinking, let's imagine that my cousin participates in a championship made of 10 races, and he has a 20% of chances of winning each race, but also 20% chance of breaking a leg because he's reckless. And I'm asking, how many wins is he expected to make in a championship of 10 races? And the naive answer would be 2 wins, because we're thinking 10 races, 20% chance of winning each, and that makes 2 races. But if you crunch the number, you will see that the result is much lower than that, and it's about 0.7. And less than half of what you would expect. And the difference is made by survival. Because if my cousin breaks his leg in the first race, he cannot participate to the following ones. And he has no chance of winning them. So he only has an 80% chance of participating to the second race, an even lower chance of participating to the third one, and so on. And so that example shows just how important is survival. And then the critical point is that the longer your time horizon, the more survival becomes predominantly important with respect to performance. And this is the mistake that a lot of people make. They make a case study or they compare two people, two investors over a short term, and then they think that we can just project the performance. They think what is the best strategy for the short term will also be the best strategy for the long term. I just need to keep repeating it. And that's very often wrong.
That is one of the single biggest problems we face in asset management. We basically, people look at very short periods of time and extrapolate them into the future, thinking that the law of large numbers is going to work for them. And as you know, all of the greatest skew comes in small sample sizes, not large sample sizes. And making the naive error of thinking that the results that you see from a very long sample period are going to be applicable to you over the next 3 years is a mismatch that people seem to intuitively not understand. And, we even have a term for it in investing. It's called hyperbolic discounting. And what that leads to are really bad results because people are forever chasing performance. It's at the base of most of the mistakes that people make earnestly. It's not like they're trying to do this. Why is it so hard for us to understand this concept? Like an example is oftentimes people get this wrong. You say in a hospital, 9 boys were born and only 1 girl. And now, do you think that's more likely to happen in the big city hospital where there's 300 births every day, or in the county hospital where there's only like 15? Everybody thinks it's the big city hospital, but as you know, it's the small city hospital. Could you help us illuminate how people can maybe more easily understand these mismatches?
Yes, the example you made is great to explain the importance of sample sizes. In the smaller hospital, you have a smaller sample size, so the law of large numbers basically doesn't apply. And that means that you can trust the average is less, and you can extrapolate with much less confidence. And this is what happens when you observe, for example, a trader who's only been trading for 2 or 3 years. You don't know whether whether his good results come from his strategy, come from the moment in time in which maybe there is a bull market, or they come from a lucky set of stocks that he selected. Either way, because the sample is small, it's less likely to reproduce in the future. Nassim Taleb also talks about this, for example, in Antifragile. He makes the example of Lindy to talk about age. And I always make the parallel because he's doing the same thing. He's talking about age as sample size. So Lindy is a principle that says the older an idea has been, or a technology, the more long-term we can expect it to continue in the future. And it's all about sample size. So for example, the longer a trader has been successful, the longer we can expect it to reproduce in the future. And the other way around, if he's only been successful for short, we basically cannot expect anything. Maybe he will continue, maybe not. And so that's very important what you were mentioning about sample sizes. And that sample sizes of all kinds. How many investments he's making, because an investor who only picks 3 stocks, for example, maybe that's luck, and so on.
So I always think of a great quote from Proust, which says, It is always thus, impelled by a state of mind destined not to last, we make our irrevocable choices. And that fits in here, I think, because we are temporal creatures. We live in time, and we tend to kind of extrapolate whatever's happening right now all the way into the future, and that is a fundamental error, the mismatch. And you've said that time horizons are the base of all of our decisions and regrets. So help us understand, if you were working with somebody as a consultant, let's say in trading, since we're talking about that, how would you help them to reorient their thinking, to make better decisions, to understand that short term has the highest variance, whereas as we get a larger sample, it's like it was the principle of why I wrote What Works on Wall Street. We needed as much data as we possibly could to make any kind of inference at all about the efficacy of those strategies.
Yeah, so I would begin with why they want to chase extraordinary performance that might not replicate. And usually we get two types of people, of competitors. We get people, investors that use reproducible success strategies, and people who use non-reproducible success strategies. Reproducible success strategy means, first of all, you make sure you can survive. You make sure you can take enough bets in size, in time, so that you can so that the law of large numbers will apply to you, and so on. Non-reproducible success strategies means you pick very few stocks. You only try you try to maximize short-term performance, and so on. What you will see is that over the short term, it's always the non-reproducible success strategies which win. And so we are tempted to copy them. We're like, I am falling behind. I should adapt to my competitors who are going faster. And what I always tell my clients is, you only compete against players who are using reproducible success strategies, and you ignore everyone else. Because if you follow the other ones, you will end up like them, successful in the short term, and then ruin or bad results in the long term. And for example, this means the importance of training and communication, for example, as a manager. If you're using a short-time horizon, maximizing performance over 1 or 2 years, you don't want to spend time training, building trust, communicating, because those are all inefficient. In the short term, only execution matters. But if you are there to stay for 20 years in the business, or even just 5 years, then training will have a disproportionate impact. And it's not anymore a source of inefficiency, that's a source of survivability and of long-term performance. And so, first thing, you need to have clear what's your time horizon. If your time horizon is going to be 20 years, which I probably advise, then you need to take the decisions on those terms. You need to only compare yourself with people that have at least the time horizon, because otherwise you will follow people that are going in the wrong direction. And once you have this time horizon, then almost everything else, almost all the good decisions will follow through.
It's interesting to me because this is so applicable to things like investing. But I have seen over my very long career in investing that intellectually, I can get people to understand this. Emotionally, it's very difficult for me to get people to understand it. My friend Jason Zweig at the Wall Street Journal says it's the difference, intellectual versus emotional, is the difference between showing someone a picture of a snake and throwing a live snake in their lap.
Yes.
They understand vividly the difference when you do that. So how I look at this as kind of a fundamental bug in human OS because we are, the investment management industry, just to stick with that, although I think this is applicable across industries. And we'll get to politics in a minute because I think that all of the incentives are skewed wrongly there. In terms of short term, you're not around for if you only have a 4-year term, you're going to be oriented towards 4 years, right? And so you're going to make a lot of errors because all of your decisions will be based on short term, not like you don't care, right? I'm gone in 4 years, so that makes me decide things differently. But how do you get? Because God knows I could use the help. How do you get people to understand this viscerally? To understand that, yeah, you're looking at this fabulous 30 or 3-year track record. That's the most misleading thing you could look at.
So there are two answers to this. The first one is, of course, the moment that people suffer from it and there is intense pain, they will learn the lesson. But of course, that's not something that you want to happen. Ideally, you want them to learn the lesson before they get too much big of pain. The second thing which I've seen is the most effective is to find the person that already internalized that principle and get them to spend some time with that person and seeing that person take some costly action that demonstrates they truly believe in a certain value, in this case, in the value of the long term. So let me explain. Let me explain exactly what I mean. I used to work for a long time in safety for manufacturing, and in particular for safety. And what you see all the time is that the CEO says, safety is very important for our company. You really need to always wear your protective equipment. And the workers will always think, does he really mean it? Does my CEO really mean it? Does he just mean that safety is important, or does he mean that it's more important than performance? When I have to take a decision with a trade-off, does my CEO want to optimize for performance or want to optimize for safety? That's always the question that's at the back of the mind. And the workers will never get it until they see that the CEO takes a costly decision that costs money to the company to prioritize safety. And I know it myself because I remember when I worked for DuPont, during my onboarding, I heard a lot of trainings about safety. I didn't believe that they really believed in this. And then what happens is that one day, our boss's boss takes 17 of us to visit a manufacturing site. There is a bus that comes to pick us up from a parking lot. And as my boss's boss is the first one to climb in the bus, and he notices that there are no safety belts. And he sends back the bus to the depot, and he asks for a new bus with the seat belts. It was a very expensive decision because there were 17 people, some really senior leaders, who wasted 45 minutes probably. That costed a lot of money. But because it costed a lot of money, all 17 people in that moment, they understood that, yes, that was a real value. And so I believe that the same thing, when you put someone in front of a person who truly believes in the value, in this case, for example, survivability, long-term investments, and they see that that person takes a costly action in which they say, we ignore those who are doing better than us, we don't change our strategy, we forgo some gains, because I really believe that that's the value of long-term of a long-term time horizon, and that's going to be profitable for us. The moment that other people see that that person is putting money on the line, they will probably get it.
Yeah, I actually love that because that gets us into skin in the game, and talk is cheap, right? Jung had a great thing which said, "You are not what you say you will do. You are what you do." And I love this particular example because I hadn't thought about it in that way. Um, Signaling becomes highly important within an organization. So if everyone is giving lip service to, "Oh, we're safety is job number one," and then to continue with your example, jumps on the bus, doesn't notice or care that there aren't safety belts, that is sending a huge message to everyone on his or her team. I love that. Are there other ways that an individual to try to make this as useful for our listeners and viewers as possible? Let's expand the industries, right? So clearly, in a manufacturing industry, safety is going to take one type of importance thing. Life and limb may be in danger. In other industries, like say finance, it's the psychic
Yes.
problems that hit people. Are there other things that people can do, especially leaders of an organization, but also people within the organization, to signal in such a way as you've just demonstrated, that everyone is like, "Oh, okay, they really, really mean this. All right, I'm going to change my behavior accordingly."
Yeah, so what I advise always my clients when they want to bring a new behavior or especially a new value, it could be ethics, it could be long-term focus, anything. What I tell them is that they should always explain what it means in concrete terms. So for example, not we care about the long term, but we care about the long term, which means that we will never take legal risk, ethical risk. We will never invest in this way. We will always keep this reserve, something like this. Then the second step is that they put it as a requirement for any kind of bonus, which means you should always say your bonus depends, one, on business objectives, and two, on not crossing any values boundaries. And you need to do both to get your bonus, because otherwise you get all kind of problems. People would take shortcuts, and so on. If the values objective is sufficient, you get all kind of virtue signalers. And so you want to have both. You want to have both necessary, the business objectives and the values objectives, and that is very costly. It's a costly signal, and that will make people understand that yes, he means it, and yes, I need to adapt. And then if you just do that, there is the problem that maybe the performance review is 1 year away, and you want to change behavior before that. So what you will do is to schedule a meeting, for example, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and you check already in that meeting what's the trajectory, whether we are on path to meet the year-end objective, which means, are we on path to meet the business objective for the year-end? And are we on path to meet the ethical objectives? For example, what did you do to make sure that we preserve our value in the long term? Did you do anything that endangers our long-term value? You check those things, and you already tell, for example, someone you're not on track, you need to change that, otherwise you will miss your bonus, and that will hit very hard and will immediately make you understand that you mean it, that you want the long term to matter.
I think that that is one of my major complaints was with the annual review. I felt that they were the least likely to impact people's behavior because, and I shifted to, people would always say to me, "Well, when do I get my review?" And I said, "Your review will be ongoing." And that seemed to work significantly better. But you touched on a couple of, again, kind of inherent things in human behavior, at least from my observation of it. And that is one of the things that I see repeatedly happen, is that people often conflate, you know, some people call it virtue signaling. They often conflate saying something like, "Gosh darn it, I'm in favor of safety." And internally, that making that statement makes them feel as if they've actually contributed something to safety. How do you, other than this technique, which is a good one, no, you said that, but you did this, right? So it's continual feedback and iteration, which I'm a big fan of. But are there other ways, like if you're trying to do it not as a boss, but just in your own life? Let's say you're trying to leave the hierarchy and gain some independence, which is something else you write about. How would you advise somebody who's trying to internalize this on their own, not necessarily a boss telling them, or not necessarily like, here's my bonus that I'm going to get, but they're just trying to level up on their own? How would you advise them to proceed?
So for me, the number one thing is, again, make sure that your role models, those that you confront yourself with, those that you try to learn with, are only people who care about the long term and who are using strategies that enable them to succeed in the long term with a very high likelihood. And the test that I ask myself, for example, is usually that person that I'm considering whether to admire, in 10 parallel worlds, will they still be successful in all 10 of them? And if the answer is yes, then it's likely to be a reproducible success strategy and maybe something that I want to imitate. And by the way, I use the same test also to consider like all aspects of life. Because personally, for example, I want to learn from people who are successful both in business and personal life and health, and not from people maybe who are only successful in business and they didn't care about everything else, about their family, their health, and so on, because maybe the strategy that they have was purposely to sacrifice those other parts of their life, and I don't want to imitate that. So for me, this is the number one thing. And then the second thing is I always like value my choices, not based on what's the return that I got in this parallel world, but I always ask myself, given 10 parallel worlds, this choice I made, how would it have gone in 10 parallel worlds? Because sometimes I take a choice that maybe in this world that didn't go very well, but if it's a choice that made sense, and maybe that's like in a lot of other worlds would have made sense, then I feel myself at peace, and I don't get that regret that leads me to then switch to less reproducible strategies.
I love the multi-world example. That's something that I do. My grandfather taught me this thing called premeditating. And essentially what he had me do was imagine what I want or what goals I want to achieve, etc. But then go through all of the reasons why. First off, figure out if you really want that goal. And the only way to do that is to say, here's what happens if I get it. Here's what happens if I don't get it. Do a lot of bad things happen if I get it? Your example of somebody who's optimized just for business outcomes, as opposed to somebody who's optimizing for a successful life. I think that is also incredibly important. In fact, the synchronicity is lovely, because yesterday I was talking to a teammate and he said exactly that. He said, I'm only interested in people who are not just successful in business. I want to see that they have a happy family, that they, they're very good at these other aspects of life. And it seems to me that, like, when I try to explain this to people, sometimes it just seems so counterintuitive to them. And so, yeah, I just, this is the concept of kind of skin in the game. That's another litmus test I like to use, in terms of, okay, am I dealing with an agent or a principal? Agents have different objectives, right? If they have no skin in the game, their behavior is going to be much different, right, than principals with skin in the game. And so does that work for for people who are not fans of the many world hypothesis of quantum physics, or how else could we get like people listening to this right now? That's a great example. That's one that I think our listeners and viewers are going to be able to say, I can start doing that right now. I can start imagining like the 10 different worlds if I'm only successful in one of them. That's a great heuristic, I think. My friend Annie Duke has a thing she calls resulting. And that is people inherently have this idea that they equate if they made a bet and they won the bet, they think that their reason for making that bet was sound. And if they lose the bet, they think that the reason was unsound. And of course, that is not true at all. You have to look at the totality of all bets made to create a base rate in terms of, okay, making this bet continually got to an 80% success ratio. Are there any other great examples like that for our listeners? Like we have a lot of people who actually take notes. And so I know that that's going to be a note. Do you have another note for people who are especially trying to work on this themselves, and or also if managers of others, how they could inspire others to kind of internalize this?
Yes, something that I usually talk about is the concept of race to the bottom. And the idea is that there are a lot of competition, let's say, that look like races to the bottom, which means those are competitions where making sacrifices brings you forward. Sacrifices that could be like, I sacrifice my health to get ahead in business, or sacrifices which could be forms of risk, which could be, I sacrifice 9 parallel worlds to get ahead, to have a chance of getting ahead in one parallel world. And the problem is that so much of life can be a race to the bottom. For example, business. And you absolutely don't want to consider when you're thinking who to imitate or who to envy, people who are participating in a race to the bottom. And I see this all the time. Like, I work in consulting. I don't want to compare myself to people who are leading consulting as a race to the bottom, in which one way where you can get ahead is by working very, very hard. Nothing against working hard, but a lot against working extremely hard, so much that you make sacrifices. And the key problem, you mentioned it earlier, is that sometimes people are like, why should I compare myself with someone who has a good all-around life? I want, for example, to learn how to best do business from someone who's the best at business. And then maybe I want to learn how to best exercise from someone who's top at exercising. The thing is that they are playing a different race than you. And if you're trying to imitate, you cannot compartmentalize. If you're imitating the strategy of someone who's only thinking about business or who's only thinking about fitness, you will take risks which are not good for you. You will take sacrifices which are not good for you. And this is something that I've noticed that very often people don't realize until they really think, you make them really think about it. Maybe you make a few examples, but then they actually notice and they're like, oh, wait a minute, you're right. If I'm going to imitate those people, I will get some of the results, but both the good and the bad. Both the ones they got into this world and the ones they got in different worlds.
And that requires a good deal, in my opinion, of the ability to abstract in your thought. Because like a lot of people can't imagine. I think one of the reasons why we're thinking well here is that, like, I used to do that all the time. I used to imagine myself in, oh, well, what if I lived here? Or what if I did this career? Or what if I, and just kind of jumbled them all together as kind of a thought process. Let's shift for a minute to, because priorities are also important, right? I think picking up on what you just said, if you're trying to optimize like the best life, so to speak, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to do everything this fitness expert did, but then I'm also going to do everything this business expert did. It's going to be a more difficult process. Um, so uh, you wrote the enemy of productivity isn't laziness, but busy work. And again, I completely share this point of view. I also share your point of view and actually put up on Twitter the other day. And I was surprised that I didn't get more pushback, which is working harder is not working better. Can you pick up on both of those themes and share the wisdom that you have learned?
Yes, so the problem is not working hard by itself, because arguably there are situations in which you do want to work hard. And the problem is working hard as a form of overcompensation. For example, I have a product that is not selling, and the reason it's not selling is because it's not a product that people want, and I overcompensate by working hard on promoting it. That's not going to work. Or it's going to get some marginal results, but that's it. And maybe that's not something you want to do. And the same thing, a lot of times at work, I see people who work hard as a way to overcompensate some problem that they don't want to face, some skill that they don't want to learn, and so on. And that always, it's tempting because it creates marginal results, but it won't scale. And at some point, they will run out of time to work hard, and they will have to sacrifice health, or they will have to drop some balls, take some shortcuts, and it doesn't work. I learned this when one day I overheard my manager at the coffee machine talking about another employee of ours, and he said, she's she is very good, but we cannot promote her because her solution to everything is working hard. And if we promote her, she will work so hard that either she will burn out or she will drop balls. And we cannot promote her until working hard is her solution. Now, you can imagine from the point of view of my colleague, if she heard that, she would be devastated. She would be like, what do you mean working hard is the reason why you cannot promote? So again, the problem is not working hard, is working hard as the solution. And that's what we want to avoid. Then, of course, like there are moments, maybe that you have a deadline, you have the night before a super important client meeting, and working hard is a skill in that case. But again, the problem is the chronic use is working hard to avoid to face other problems, and that's a form of laziness.
I wonder about your opinion of, like, I think that a lot of this attitude, as we evolved, right, historically, before all of our innovations, working hard was the only way to actually get ahead, because work it done equaled pretty much results gotten, right? Like if you're trying to dig a hole or you're trying to farm or do any of that thing successfully, there is that equation. And so it seems to me that, like, I wonder, are we not blank slates, right? Do we come out with kind of the inherited bits of our evolutionary history, where maybe that's one of the reasons why it's hard to get these messages across to people? What do you suggest? What would you do if I came to you and I hired you and I said, I've got this super smart person over here. We'll use the woman that you used as an example, right? Hard work, can't promote her because hard work doesn't scale. And if you were advising me, what would you tell me to do with her specifically, with that kind of behavior?
Yeah. So I would suggest you and to have a conversation with her and explaining to her basically how promotion works in the company. And usually at work, the rule for promotion is you don't promote someone because they did their previous work excellently, but you promote someone because they demonstrated that they will be able to handle the next role. That's usually the role, and a lot of people, especially young people, they don't get. And once you explain that, then naturally it comes forward that working hard is not what will get you promoted. I mean, again, like all things equal, the person who works hard has an advantage, but all things equal. And all things equal means you need to have understood also what you have to do differently, which are the skills that you need to demonstrate to move to the next level. And so I would have a conversation with the person and tell her, like, I'm very happy with you. I will say something along the lines like, I'm happy that you're an employee at this company and I appreciate your work ethic. And I think that with this work ethic, you will get far ahead in life. However, work ethic is not sufficient to get ahead, to advance. The other condition which you need to have to advance is to demonstrate that you have the skill and the know-how that are required by the next role. In this case, your next role, for example, let's say that I'm an individual contributor and they want to move to management. In this case, some of the skills that you need to demonstrate is the ability to delegate, the ability to give feedback to others in a way that is helpful, which means that the other person feels more motivated to continue rather than you just giving some piece of knowledge and then the other person is less motivated to continue, is less energetic of working on what they were doing before, and these kind of things. And usually having this conversation will have a positive effect on the other person, will make them understand that you are there to support and that they're missing something. Now there is one key missing piece on that. Every time that people ask me like how they would solve a very specific problem with one of their employees, there are always two components. One is the conversation that you will have with that employee and what you will say. And the other one is everything else you did before and whether the employee trusts that you are a good manager for them and that you have their best interest at heart. Because if they don't believe that, because if what you did in the past made them think that you don't have their best interest at heart, then they're like, why, even if you say the perfect words, why should they listen to you? And so the first thing would be to take some action that demonstrates that you have their best interest at heart, and not in an easy way. For example, easy way would be, oh, I give you a bonus, I give you the day off, we go out and we drink a beer. That's too cheap of an action or too much of a shortcut that people don't really then trust you. But it should be maybe having a conversation which is a bit difficult and in which you're really demonstrating that you are there for them. Maybe you're taking some of your very busy time to understand their point of view on something and to understand one roadblock that they're having. And if you do it, and they will start to believe that to trust that you are a good manager and that you have their best interest at heart, then they will be ready for this conversation, which is much more hard. And it's about their deeply held beliefs about what it means to do great work.
This is gelling for me because what I keep hearing you say is you really need to make take an action, not just say a word or say a phrase, but actually take an action that is not easy. I love your example of, yeah, let's go out and have a beer and I'm going to tell you how great I think you are. That's pretty easy to do. And so what you are recommending, and I think resonates with me, is the action has to not only be costly in terms of either time or money or setting back some objective or any of that to demonstrate, like we're back to the seatbelts on the bus, that you are that way. But you also have to do that because another point you make is that I love is that personality in many respects is habits, right? And so if you can habituate what we're talking about right now, that's going to really become part of the way your personality, the way you actually do things. And so, if you were teaching a class on this, be it this aspect, or how to prioritize, or any of the aspects that you write so convincingly about, what would be kind of lesson one? You're the professor. I'm coming into your class, and I'm taking the class because I want to learn all of these techniques. I want to be able to embody them. You can either give me the first lesson or give me the syllabus, whatever way you feel more comfortable making the point.
Yeah, so the question is, for example, a class for managers on what to prioritize. So what I would tell them is that there are basically three things that need to happen for their people to have what it takes to do good work and to feel like doing good work is worth it. Because a lot of times it just happens so that the bottleneck is that your people don't believe that doing good work is worth it. Or they don't believe that prioritizing the long term is worth it. And so they don't do it. And so for me, the three things are clarity, feedback, and trust. So the first thing is that you should be very clear about what you need from there. And number one advice would be, don't be abstract, be concrete. For example, if you tell people you need to be ethical, like everyone will nod, but everyone will have a different opinion of what ethical means. Then you should always you should trigger your mind every time you say something abstract. You should continue with what I mean is, and then something concrete, which means, for example, it could be something like, we never lie to customers. And even omissions could be lies. Maybe that's your stance, for example. If you clarify those two things, then it will be clear. This is the first step. Then, if you brought clarity, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second thing you should give is feedback. And that's because I know very few people which will get what you need out of them at the first try. What instead is needed very often is that you ask them to do something, they do it, and then you give them feedback on that. And that has to be both positive and negative. Because sometimes the problem is that they do something wrong and they don't notice. And if you don't tell them, they will keep doing it wrong. A lot of times people, they know abstractly what is the right thing to do, but they don't know how to do it right. For example, all managers, they know that delegating and giving feedback are the right things to do. Very few know how to do it right. And the only way where you can teach that is you observe them doing it and you give them some feedback. And you should do the same with your people. And you should also give positive feedback. Because what happens a lot of times is that people do a thing and then they don't see that anyone is noticing it. And then they wonder whether it's worth doing it again. And that applies with a lot of things when you take the time to do something, to give feedback to another colleague and so on. And you as a manager, you want to enforce it. So this is the second step, feedback. So we have clarity, feedback, and then this is still not necessary. The third step is trust. And trust is what we were saying before. When you say those two things, people will understand what it means, but they don't know whether you want it even when it's hard, even when it takes effort, even when it means sacrificing the short term. And you should build some action that creates trust that you really mean what you're saying. Also, it should be, for example, when you delegate something, a lot of times people don't trust that you mean it. For example, deadlines. I know so many managers which then say something like, send me the report by Friday. And then because the other person sends it on Friday, they don't get an acknowledgement. They start believing that it's not necessary by Friday. They start to believe that when the manager gives a deadline, it's not really a deadline. So again, create action that demonstrate that they can trust your words. So these are the three things you need to do as a manager: clarity, feedback, and trust. clarity about what you need them, feedback about not only what's the right thing to do, but also the right way to do it, and then trust that when you say something, they can trust that you mean it. And these are the three things you should prioritize.
And in a way, it's the consistency of giving the first two that build the third, trust, right? I think that's an excellent formula. You've written another thing that I found quite interesting, and I loved it because I didn't normally think this way. And that is, if you want to change something, what you gotta do is desire the actions that lead to the change, not envision the change itself. Can you expand on that a little? Because that really struck me as I was getting ready to talk to you. I hadn't seen it put that way before, and it just unlocked oh, of course, that makes like total sense.
Yes, so I've noticed this myself when I was going to the gym. And the thing I've noticed was that everyone desires to be fit, but the people who are fit are the ones who are frustrated when the gym is closed, for example. They are they are the ones who don't only desire being fit, but they also desire exercising. And the question is, what makes them desire exercising? And usually the thing is, we all have the knowledge of the link. If you exercise, you get fit eventually. What differentiates is that only some of us, when you exercise, your brain is already releasing the dopamine and everything else that corresponds to the result. So this is like, you probably know about the Pavlov experiments with dogs, where the scientist is ringing the bell every time he gives them food, so that when he only rings the bell, they salivate. What does the salivation mean? It means that the dog desires not only the food, but it also desires the bell in a way. And that's kind of the same thing. You desire the action when doing the action already gives in your brain, shows up as if you are getting the rewards, kind of. And this is kind of like what you want to have if you want to keep exercising the behaviors. Now, I simplified it a lot, and if anyone is interested in the neuroscience of it, what I've said is not completely right. It was the super summarized version. In the book, The Control Heuristic, I explain it much better and much more finally. But that's the idea. To pass the habit, you need to associate the expected emotional outcome of the action with doing the action, not with the reward. Doing the action must feel like you're already getting the reward. And that's what creating habits means.
Yeah. And you also talk quite a bit about, the idea that, as one of my guests said, perfectionism is a 100% tax. In other words, it doesn't really exist, Plato notwithstanding, right? There are no perfect forms. There are North Stars and compasses, but you're probably never going to get the ideal of something. And you also write a lot about fear. And what I like when you write about fear is you acknowledge everybody has fears. And the only way to deal with that is acknowledge the fact that everybody has fears. And the only way to deal with them is to work through them, not try to avoid them, not try to, have a behavior that makes you less fearful, I guess, right? Because that's a variable you might not want to optimize on, right? So walk me through like what you would tell somebody I bring you in as a consultant. You find somebody who's like got a lot of good skills. They're very talented, but they have a lot of avoidance behavior of doing specific things that would make their skills scale quite a bit more. So good for that person, good for me as the owner of the company. What would be your process there?
Yes. So what you shouldn't do is try to reason with it. Because I used to say it's not a cortex problem. Like the cortex is the part of the brain that thinks, and then there are other parts of the brain which are about fear and so on. The problem is not the cortex, so you shouldn't work on the cortex. You shouldn't reason with them. That's not the bottleneck. It will not help. What you should do is get them to do some action that they're avoiding and set them up for success, so that the moment that they do the action they were avoiding and they see that it leads to a good result, the problem would be over. Now, the problem is, how do you get them to do the action that they're avoiding? And this solution, in a lot of cases, doesn't work always, but often enough for me to recommend it, is give a next step which is small enough that it feels actionable. So let's say, for example, that the thing that the person is avoiding is calling customers, for example. If you tell that person you should call 10 customers, they will not do it. Or they will do it in a way that self-sabotages. They will call them like in ineffective ways. They will talk about the way what it will not work. Should do something as small as possible, which means call one customer. Then you should be the easiest customer. Someone that they already know, or someone that you know that is very good mood, helpful, listening, something like this. And then you should set them for success. Which means what I would do is that I would role play that with them. I will tell them, imagine that I am the customer, call me. And we do a fake conversation, like I'm role playing as the customer. Maybe after 30 seconds, I reinforce them. I stop 1 second. I give them some feedback. I point out the good because I need to reinforce them. Then if I see something bad or something that is preventing the conversation from succeeding, I tell them. We do this exercise 3 to 4 or 5 times. Then they get the confidence and the know-how. They try it with the customer, the easy customer, let's say. Hopefully it goes well. If it goes well, problem 90% solved. So that's kind of the approach. So give them a concrete step which is actionable. It should be something that they know exactly what they have to do. They shouldn't have to figure it out, because otherwise their mind is avoiding that and they will not do it. Then you should reinforce it. And the best way to reinforce is to role play. Either you role play it or you play the hypothetical. You say, what would you do? Then you bring out some common problems. For example, what would you do if the client says they're busy? What would you do if the client says he doesn't like the idea? Something like that. You had them overcome the obstacles. You reinforce it. You set them for success. You get them to do it. You follow up on them. And then it will work.
That's what I would refer to as kind of meta practice, right? In terms of doing that step by step. I think that's excellent advice. What happens when let's go back in your step by step. So we'll just stick with your example. We have somebody who's really gifted, but they have this impediment to they think it's rude to call customers, or they think they're imposing or whatever. And so we start and we role play, and you teach them, like, I'm busy, I'm this, I'm that, I don't like the idea. What happens? Do you ever introduce in the role playing as the consultant to the company? Do you ever introduce the shot out of nowhere, right? Do you ever, because I'm thinking about fears again. So you get the person there. Then what happens if somebody does something quite either rude or don't call me. I hate your company. I'm just thinking of these on the fly. And doesn't that put the person right back into fear?
Yes. So that's why I especially mentioned that the first step should be an easy one. You should ask them to call a client that you kind of know that these things won't happen. You should ask him to call a client where you know that they won't say you rude, something like this. So this is one of the things. The other thing which you should also do is often while you're doing the role play, to explain how you're feeling and what you're thinking. Because you mentioned indeed that common reason why people don't like to call is because they think that they're rude, that they're imposing. And so what I will do is that as soon, for example, as the person is role playing with me and they're informing me of the product of the company, I will tell them that now I'm feeling interested because I indeed have this problem and I want to know whether the product that you're selling me helps solve it. And sometimes people don't get this. Sometimes people don't get it. The other person might be actually looking for your call. Then the question is under which condition they might be looking for your call. For example, if you demonstrate very early on that you will not waste their time. And so we would work a little bit on how you can demonstrate that. But very important is to teach the other, as you're role playing, to say how you're feeling. Because very often when we are avoiding to do something is because we don't know how we would feel or how the person in front of us is feeling. And it helps to say that.
Do you have techniques where I understand that the person that you're helping and coaching, to get them to, I love the process of use a concrete step that they can take, make it one that is pretty easy to determine that it's going to go well, give them the feedback, ask about the feeling. And so that's a great step-by-step process. But what about the person who, back to the difficult, dealing with difficult people? Is that something that you would simply say, well, you use their difficulty in determining whether you want them as a particular client? What about a situation where, your biggest client also happens to be a real difficult person?
So in this case, I would help them I would role play as the difficult client, for example, and I would explain why I'm being difficult, why I'm being rude. I would, for example, say to my client, like to the person I'm working with, why are you calling me? And then immediately I will stop and I explain to them why I'm saying it, why it's likely that I'm saying it. And for example, I could say like, the reason why I say this is probably because I have a lot of people who call me and waste my time. It could be because I have a terrible headache. And depending on those two situations, this is what you can do. And then now let's try it.
Yeah. I love that, because what you're introducing, it sounds like to me, is you're training the person you're coaching on thinking, not being reactive, but rather thinking, oh, well, I wonder, maybe he's just super busy and he's got a bunch of people calling him, or maybe he's got a headache, or maybe, he's hungover or whatever. The ability to kind of think, oh, there might be a lot of reasons for that, allows them maybe to not take it personally, so to speak. And it actually puts them in a position where they can be helpful, right? So what you're doing, which I think is great, is you're teaching them how to reframe what's going on. And that's always been something that I've believed very passionately. You can reframe things. You're gonna, on average, if we're looking at a very long sample, you're going to be able to do better than not. Do you have any other techniques just on this, in terms of helping people to reframe how they approach these things that through building habits which become personality, right? that they could think about or do that would, kind of really cement this in the way that they go about their occupation? Or it doesn't even have to be occupation, right? It's like, this is being a successful parent. This is being a successful, fill in the blank.
Yeah, so I have a couple of things, but they work much less than what I just said. Like having another person which is doing the exercise with you works at success percentages which are so much higher than everything else, because you have another person which is guiding you, helping you, pushing you, and so on. That said, things that work to a lower degree, one include role playing in your head the things which might go wrong. So you're thinking, like, let's say that the habit I want to get is, I don't know, running every morning. And then I would ask myself, what are the reasons why tomorrow I might not be running? Possibilities could be bad weather, my knee has a little bit of pain, or something like this. And then the question is, what you will do in this case. So if there is bad weather, is the decision you will not run? Is the decision you will run the following day? Is the decision you run with the appropriate gear? What about if your knee is a bit painful? Will you just run maybe slower? Will you run half the distance? Will you take a break? And usually, if you think about the obstacles in advance, you're much more likely that when the obstacle comes, you will actually follow through with your plan rather than just stopping. So this is one thing. The other thing which I would ask them is to think very carefully about their values. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. This starts from, I think it was an observation I read from Tony Robbins, on which I have like there are some things he wrote which I like very much. There are other things which I like a bit less. But I think that one of the observations he made is mixed values produce mixed results. And a lot of time when you see someone who's struggling to do something, is because he's in half minds about it. And the reason why he's in half minds about it is because he has contrasting values. Which, I mean, values which are incompatible in the context of this action. And he will not proceed until you untangle that. Or he will proceed, but he will do the action in a way which is not successful. And so sometimes it helps to have the conversation with a friend, with a coach, but sometimes it helps just to think about yourself. Like, there is this action I'm struggling. Could it be that there are different values of mine which are conflicting? And then you want to think, like, is there any way in which I can do the action in such a way that both values get respected, for example? Or just acknowledging that as long as those values remain like this, you will not have great success with that action. And what to do about it? Do you just abandon the pursuit? Do you embark on a journey to change your values? For example, by exposing yourself to people who solve this internal conflict? Or there are a lot of answers, and no answer is perfect, but any answer is better than not thinking about it and proceed as if the conflict were not there.
I think that's great advice. I love mixed values lead to mixed results. Do you advocate? One of the things that I have found very helpful, and back kind of to this idea that I spoke of earlier, that my grandfather taught me about premeditating, that involves writing. And I have found, and I always have advocated, that writing helps you understand whether you understand or not. and it works across the spectrum, right? It works for to pick up on your values thing. The advice I would give there is write out the values that you have And, you might surprise yourself because the act of writing actually engages a different way of thinking about it. Uh, do you find that there's similar value in that pursuit as well?
Totally. So writing is exactly how I think. Like a lot of times, like if there is a difficult problem, or I need to write it. And if I write it usually, and if I manage to keep my head on the sheet of paper without checking my phone for 20 minutes, usually I get to a solution or to some progress. And it works really well. And the reason it works is because if you have two things, two beliefs which are incompatible, they can live in your head. Like our head can hold incompatible beliefs and there is no mechanism to check coherence. On the sheet of paper, when you write two things against each other, next to each other, you will notice if there is an incoherence. So you mentioned the exercise of writing down the values. Well, I do this exercise with some people, not with business clients, but sometimes like they ask me to do like personal growth talks. And one of the exercises I do is that I ask the audience to write down a list of values. And they take a few minutes and they write 5 to 10 values. And then I ask them to put them in order from the most important to the least important. And everyone does that. And then I ask them to write down the schedule for last week and to check whether the way they use their time matches the order of the list of values. And if not, to rearrange the list in the appropriate order so that it explains the schedule from last week. And that's such a powerful exercise. I did it myself. I thought I had some values, but when I compared my list of values with my schedule, I realized I had different values. And you will realize that that list of values that you have will produce that schedule. And if you want to have a different schedule, you will need to change your values or the priority of themselves.
Yeah. And I love that example because that also works as an incredible tool in prioritization of things, right? Because you'll often see, I say to people, a lot of people often ask me like, what should I do because of X, right? And I'll say, well, I mean, you say you want X, but it seems that you're always doing Y. Why are you always doing Y? And sometimes the responses are really interesting because you can tell pretty quickly who has written it out and who has not. I love your example that ideas that are complete opposites of one another can live comfortably in your head. But I call writing pushing it into the real world because, there it is on the paper. And like I've had a writing habit for all of my adult life. And, when people ask me, give me one thing that you think would really be able to, help me more than anything, that's the piece of advice I give is like, write everything out. If you're having a challenge, write it out. If you don't know, write it out because you'll quickly see whether you know or not, which leads to another thing you talk a lot about, which is how to maintain and optimize positive compounding. And I think basically you've already given all of the things that lead to positive compounding, the feedback idea, the earning trust, but another one I think is a little counterintuitive because another thing that I believe, at least in looking at very successful people, is agility, the ability to iterate quickly, and or change directions. How do you work that in? How do you work in, like in the process? Is there a place where where there's a pause that's like, I need to be agile. I need to maybe go over here. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Lao Tzu, and he compares everything to water, and movement is life, right? And stasis is death. But how do you work that part in, like, into a process?
So, more than a process, I would say a system. And personally, for me, it's about doing a bit of everything. So let me explain what I mean. What I mean by that. Um, so this is a problem that I always have, like in my life. Like, which time horizon do I optimize it with? This project which I started, should I keep it long enough because maybe at some point I will start seeing the results, or is is it just that it's not working and I should change and iterate? Um, this problem which I'm seeing, is it worth changing or not? And the best, imperfect but best answer I've found is do a bit of everything. As in, sometimes think about it like um make like the argument of changing and of how you can change, what you should change, and so on. And sometimes make the argument of no, staying there for the long staying how can I persist and so on. And I think that just the idea of alternating between those point of views usually will help you um get to a solution. So this is one thing. Like, for example, for my life, I always try to live it as in I try to spend like part of my schedule as if like I only had 1 year left to live. And then I try to spend part of my schedule as if I will live until I get 100 years old, and part of my schedule as if I have 20 years, for example. And the idea is like to think about this as in like, because some point, one time horizon might make you think about some changes and so on. And the trick is, whatever you do not take decisions which endanger the other points of view. So yes, a part of my schedule, I leave it as if I only had 1 year to live, but I never do anything which would endanger like my quality of life when I'm 100 years old. And then 100 years old, yes, I spend part of my schedule optimized, like living as if, taking actions which make it, but never at the point which I make hell my current life as if I lived only 1 year. That's kind of the how I try to make it all stay together. And I think that it works very well.
That's very helpful, and I think it fits really nicely with your multi-world outcome analysis, because it gets you to understand and unlock your thinking in terms of time, and I think that is that's actually quite a brilliant way to do it. I love that. I want to shift gears because I know we're bumping up against our time here.
So,
But why did you live in Kazakhstan?
so I didn't spend so long there. I spent a few months. Uh, so basically, I visited for someone I knew. Then I started teaching some courses, consulting for a company there. Uh, I spent less than a year, but it's been a good experience.
And
Yeah.
the reason I asked that one is because I know people who've traveled there and come back with these like fantastic stories about how different it is. One of the reasons why I'm a huge lover of travel is because I think it opens the mind, it opens your aperture, and it helps you understand that people really do think differently in different parts of the world. What would you tell our listeners and viewers? Like, what are your takeaways from having lived and worked in, Italy, Germany, Kazakhstan, Singapore? Um, what were the insights that you walked away with that maybe you weren't expecting, or you were expecting and they confirmed them?
Well, so one thing is that you really learn lot of. So one superficial thing would be that you learn a lot of values, like different values, different ways to see the world. That's the superficial thing. The thing which I would, which instead hits me from that is the fact that you notice that there are a lot of great people, a lot of smart people, and it's not that they have different values, ways of thinking, ways of doing things, but it's that once you get to live with them and you notice that they are good people, you notice that not only there can be something different, but that there can be something different which is also like comes from the same values as you, expressed different, or the same ways of working, or like if doing things efficiently can be done in different ways. And you don't really notice that until you've worked with someone and you notice that they share the same, for example, attention to efficiency as you do, but then they do some things different. Or they share the same values of fairness and then they do something differently. And then you realize that there are a lot of things, things that you're not, that you believe differently. And that's why you need to live there. Because if you just learn how other people do different things, you don't get the fact that those people, they could be your best friend. They could be maybe your future spouse. They would be someone you would have a believe that they have the same values as you, and yet they're doing things different. And you need to live it. And then you realize that, wow, maybe the next time that I see someone who's doing the thing differently, maybe they could still have the same value system.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I love your work. I think that you unlike many consultants that I talk to, you make a lot of sense and you offer very actionable advice, which I love. Because word salads can get in the way. I love the fact that you don't do that. You give very specific action items, and that leads to a path that I think people just listening to this podcast are going to be able to actually write down, hopefully, and then actually put it into use immediately. That's the other thing I like. You are giving what I would call excellent but practical advice that allows people to like, oh, I can do that. So I very much appreciate it. At the end of our podcast, Luca, we always ask our guests a funny question, which is, we're going to wave a magic wand and we're going to make you the emperor of the world for one day. You can't kill anyone and you can't put anyone in a re-education camp, but you can speak into a magical microphone and say two things. And the effect will be that the entire 8 billion population of the world is going to wake up whenever their tomorrow is. And they're going to think they had those two thoughts themselves. And they're going to immediately start acting on them. What do you have for us?
So I think that, sorry, I just don't want to give any answer. I think that one should be ask people what their problems are and really listen. Which I mean, like, so that you really understand what are the challenges that the other person is facing, with like not projecting anything. And then the second thought would be, so going a bit more like into more abstract ideas and the ideas of politics. Like, one thing that I would like people is to like not lower the level when we are talking about politics. And by this I mean, like, so much of what I'm seeing happens because we think it's acceptable to take big strawmans, to accept someone from our side lying to bring forward one of our points, to conceal some problems on our side when to give bad data, or to like accept bad information from our side if it brings our point forward, to not listen to the other person even if they have a good point, because considering that the other party has a good point would be like diminishing the favor on our side and something like that. And just to like keep the level like the level of discussion at a high level, by which I mean like you listen to the other person. If they make a good point, that's a good point. You try not to make bad points on your side. And I think that it will help a lot. Yeah.
I love both of those. And I love the idea, and it's something I've always advocated, is straw men are easy to build. Steel men are much harder to build. And if you can steel man your opponent's argument, you're going to learn a tremendous amount that you won't learn if you just stick with straw man. But you demonstrated something else that I'm going to leave in, because I think it's so incredibly important. And that was, you took your time to think about the answers. And you wouldn't guess how unusual that is. And the reason I'm going to leave that period in is people need to understand that that's the much better way to do things. Because what you demonstrated is you're an active listener. And by that, I mean, you weren't listening to that question with an immediate, like, this is going to be my response. You listen, and then you demonstrated something that I find, unfortunately, way too rare, which is you thought about it. And I love that. I absolutely love that. So I am definitely going to try to teach a lesson by leaving the pause in, because so many human beings, like they want to fill that pause, right? And it is such a good skill. Literally anyone listening to us right now, if you can learn from Luca's last little bit there, that one skill, you're going to level up. You're not going to even understand how much you're going to be able to level up, because you're going to realize, maybe I wasn't listening to people before, and maybe I do need to take the pause and time to think. So I absolutely loved the way that you demonstrated that.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you so much
Jim,
for sharing.
If I can add just one thing on what you said earlier before you asked me the question. And you were talking about consultants that sometimes they say word salads. I just want to give a piece of advice for people who sometimes happens to hire consultants or to work with them, is take a few sentences that those people say, walk to the line employee that you have in your company, the office worker and so on, and say those same sentences and ask them if they make sense. For me, that's one bar and one test that you can have for consultants to notice some red flags of many consultants.
I love that. I love that, because if you have, and I'll add an addendum, which you might or might not agree with. If you have a hard time saying that sentence to your teammate, you're going to learn very quickly. Ooh, okay, that's maybe not the advice I want. I love it.
Yeah.
Where can people find you and your books and your company?
Yes, so my website is luca-dellanna.com with double L and double N. And my books can be found on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, basically everywhere, Apple, everything. Yes.
Terrific. Well, I highly recommend people get your books and visit your website. This has been absolutely a pleasure. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jim, for having me.